So K2. Why is K2 considered a difficult? Because it's more difficult than Everest, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that. So certainly the easiest route on K2 is significantly harder and objectively more dangerous than the routes on Everest. Now, of course, there are routes on Everest that are more difficult to the easiest routes on K2. It sort of stands to reason. But the easiest way of getting up K2 is significantly harder than the normal ways of getting up and the easy ways of getting up Everest. So K2 sort of has this rather sort of strange list of epithets where it's not necessarily the supreme of anything. It's not necessarily the highest, obviously, the most difficult, the worst weather, the coldest, the list goes on, the most remote. But it falls pretty high up on so many of those lists that when you aggregate all of those things that basically make it tricky or dangerous or reasons why you may not want to go in the first place, there aren't many mountains around the world that would necessarily stand as stand up to it in that sense. So yeah, there are mountains which are more difficult. There are mountains which have a higher death rate. There are mountains. Well, there's one mountain that's higher. There are mountains which are more remote. But when you gather all of those data sets in together, it does sort of push K2 towards the fore. And that's not to say that there might not be something that could equal it, or maybe slightly worse. But generally speaking, so hence why I would sort of refer to it as being widely considered the most difficult and dangerous mountain in the world. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying it is the most dangerous or the most difficult. So what are the kind of things that make it so? So firstly, it's incredibly remote. It's a 120 kilometre, so 75, 80 mile walk to get to base camp. Mm-hmm. There's no other way in other than that. You have to do that walk. It takes between 7 and 9 days, especially when you're acclimatizing and when you're going on your way up the mountain. Although on the way back, you've still got to walk out. It is slightly quicker because I say it's downhill, but actually you just want to get the hell out of there. But also the acclimatization isn't so much a problem. Everest, in comparison, and I'm sort of slightly picking my statistics here, but for instance, on the north side of Everest, there's a metalled road that gets you to base camp.
Right.
So as a tourist, you can drive to 5,200 metres on the north side of Everest. On the south side, you still have to trek in, but on the north side, you can drive in, and people do that with mini travel bottles of oxygen and things like that to get their photo at Everest Base Camp. So it's a very long way to walk in. It's incredibly steep. Any picture of K2 that you see, I think anyone would recognise that if you were to get a person, or especially a child, to draw a picture of a mountain, that's what they would draw. They'd draw a triangle, and that's what K2 looks like, almost from any angle. It's every side of it is steep. All of the routes up the mountain average around 40 to 45 degrees. So whichever route you try and take, it is steep one way or another. And that includes the fact that when you get up towards the summit, actually you have a relatively gentler section called the shoulder. So by default, that makes the average of the rest of it slightly worse. Height, so it's 8,611 metres, so about 250 metres lower than Everest. And it says one of the 8,000 metre peaks, you are well up into what's known rather evocatively as the death zone, really above sort of about 7,500 to 8,000 metres. That's the point at which the human body cannot really acclimatise anymore. You're getting to the point where either you are having to be incredibly quick, not to mention the fact you are incredibly fit and strong, or you're using oxygen. Mm-hmm. Now, these days, most people do use oxygen on K2. Right. Traditionally, actually, it's had a relatively low usage of oxygen because it tended to be smaller teams. They didn't have the logistical support that teams on Everest might have, of having lots of porters and lots of Sherpas and equivalents to help stock the mountain. So, and of course, it tended to attract some of the best climbers in the world. So people were just naturally fitter and more attuned and more willing to give it a go without oxygen. And whilst you might think, well, hang on a minute, why would you try that? There are a few things that might lend you to think actually that's not a bad thought to try it without oxygen.
Okay.
Having said that, and as you can see sitting in front of me, I still have all my fingers and toes, and I quite like my fingers and toes, and that's one of the things that oxygen is particularly good for, is minimising the risk of or reducing the risk of frostbite.
Because it keeps your blood flowing.
Yeah, basically, it allows your body, or as you start to get cold, capillaries start to constrict. The body keeps the blood flow to the core to preserve the vital organs, and essentially is sucking the. I'm not a doctor here, so the terminology is not necessarily right, but it's sucking the blood away from the extremities, which is why people get frozen toes, frozen fingers, frozen noses, etc. So the oxygen helps that. It helps maintain the right flow of blood around the body. So it reduces that impact. So that's one of the other things on there. Weather-wise, the Karakoram mountain range. So sort of it's at the end of the Himalayas. Technically it's not part of the Himalayas, even though if you looked at a map, it all looks like one big mountain range. But the Karakoram, it just suffers from very inconsistent, very changeable weather systems. It's not nearly as easily to predict the weather as it is in Nepal, especially in sort of the Everest region, where you have the sense of the monsoon seasons of coming up, monsoon weather systems of coming up through the Bay of Bengal, and therefore it's much easier to predict what's going to happen as a result of all of that. Whereas with that much more remote, where we are in the Karakoram, and the weather system is that much more changeable. The mountain itself, I guess, because of the steepness and the sort of the two most commonly climbed routes, so the Abruzzi spur and the Chezen spur, are a veritable sort of pinball alley of avalanche and rockfall every single day. So on Everest, you tend not to climb with a helmet. I think when I did it, and I did it from the north side, I didn't take a helmet with me at all.
Okay.
These days you might have people who wear a helmet on the south side through the Khumbu icefall, but some will wear helmets up top, but a lot of people won't. Everest, everybody, K2, everyone leaving base camp, you've got your helmet with you because of the dangers. As we speak, there are a couple of international expeditions trying to do a winter summit of K2. It remains to be the only 8,000 metre peak that has not been climbed in winter.